This video is sponsored by Rive. Rive is not trying to replace or compete with After Effects. That's a quote from the founder and CEO of Rive, and he followed that up with, After Effects is designed to export video. Rive is designed for interactivity. That's probably the best explanation of why you would want to use Rive, but it's not the only reason. As an After Effects user, you can still leverage the unique capabilities and workflows that Rive has to offer in your motion design projects, even without the interactivity. This is the second tutorial in a series where it's my goal to get After Effects users up to speed with Rive and creating your first 3 animations. In the first tutorial, I showed how to build a looping animation in Rive with a workflow very similar to how I'd work in After Effects. In this tutorial, we'll be looking at some of the unique animation features Rive has to offer that don't exist anywhere in After Effects. And if you want to get even more of a jump start on Rive, you can download a PDF of my best practices and most used keyboard shortcuts down in the description. Now let's get into this. This is the animation we'll be recreating in this tutorial. It's for Transform Sandwich, another one of our freebies over at Battleaxe. You can check this out for yourself in your own browser. The link is down in the description, but your eyes are not deceiving you. This is not playing back at 60 frames per second. That was a very deliberate decision. I wanted this one playing at 12 frames per second, and I'm gonna show you how to do that as well. But over here in Rive, I've already recreated some of the artwork right in Rive with parametric or procedural shapes, basically just a bunch of rectangles and an ellipse there in the middle for the anchor point. So this is a very simple design. The only thing that's missing is this slice of bread, which I originally made this in Illustrator. And this, since it's not just a procedural shape, would be a little bit more difficult to recreate in Rive, but we don't have to recreate it. I could bring it over into Rive if I exported it as an SVG and then imported it right here in my Assets tab. I could click the plus and choose that, but there's actually an even quicker way of doing this. If I just jump back to Illustrator, copy that bread, go back to Rive and paste, it's going to import that, uploading it as an SVG file from your clipboard, and right there's layer 1, there's my asset. I could drag it out to my artboard and reposition it however I need, and that's how quick it is to get objects from Illustrator into Rive. That is super, super convenient, and I don't think a lot of people know you can do that. So what I wanna do is rename this group Bread, and inside that group is a custom shape path. So paths inside of Rive are really, really great. I like them a lot more than what we have in After Effects because we actually have access to all of the vertices and the tangents for the Bezier handles as modifiable and keyframeable properties. So with my path selected, if I go over here in my properties panel and I choose edit vertices, I can see all of these Bezier paths. The triangle, that's telling me that's the first vertex in the path. I can click and drag this to manipulate it, modify these Bezier handles the same way you would think that you could in any other program, but there's some really great extra controls. So let's just select one point and take a look at the control options that we have over here for our vertices. So first of all, there's a position, X and Y point for the selected vertice. So every single one of these vertices has position values. That actually exists in After Effects as well, but it is not accessible very easily like this. And we definitely can't just keyframe those values. That's something we'd have to use the path to null script to be able to control individual vertices. And even then, we don't have these extra controls, which I'm gonna walk you through right now. Let's start with these tabs right up here. This is the vertice type. So if I change it to straight, that's the first option. It removes the handles. We don't have any other controls other than roundness. So it's a little hard to see right now. If I move this up so it's more of a point and I change the corner roundness, there you go. You can see exactly what that's doing. And you can do this for any number of vertices on your path. Let's undo that and get back to where we were. The next option is mirrored. This is going to give us Bezier handles on either side that are symmetrical. So when I move one side of the Bezier handle, the opposite handle is going to mirror that angle and length. I'll undo one more time and let's go to the next option, which is detached. This is going to give us individual controls for the length and rotation of each Bezier handle. And then finally, we have this asymmetric, which is going to keep the same angle between those paths, so make nice smooth curves, but give us different length options. So those are 4 different vertice types within a path in Rive. They're all extremely handy, and it makes working with paths in Rive really, really easy. So what I wanna do is just revert back to where we were originally. This is how the paths were imported by default. And because this vertex vertex is set to detached. I have individual controls for the angle and length of each one of the handles. So I can modify it this way or interactively right on the artboard. All right, so let's say that we wanna stretch this a little bit. I don't have to manipulate every single one of these path points. I could go into here, and if I was in animate mode, I could say, jump into my timeline, and there's a button that says key all vertices. That will key absolutely every vertex in the path, as well as all of their tangents. So there is a button to quickly key everything, or you could add individual keys. But I don't have to do that for this animation. Let's just take a step back, and I'm gonna get out of this mode just by pressing Enter and reframe this just by holding spacebar and panning. And let's look at the structure of the shape. Just like in After Effects, we have a hierarchy. There's the path, but that's inside of a shape group, and that's where the styling is being applied, and that's within another group. This is just a standard group object inside of our hierarchy. But if I were to grab this group or even the shape group and try to scale this down, you see that it's going to also scale the styling, just like in After Effects. Since that styling is happening before that transformation, it's going to scale the stroke as well. However, if I go into the path, again, just like in After Effects, and scale this down, it's going to maintain that stroke width, and that's what I want. So for this first timeline, all I want to do is squish the bread horizontally, basically, on that X axis. So let's grab that scale position and set a keyframe on the X scale right at the start of the timeline, and then move forward to the end of the timeline and turn that down to maybe, let's say 10%. That looks pretty good. Now, this is not exactly what I want the bread to look like, but it's getting all of those points and those handles squished in to where relatively I want them to be. Now that I have that, I can go into my path mode. So let's grab that path and press Enter or click the button right here to edit vertices. And I'm gonna zoom in a little bit closer and then go to the end of my timeline. Let's make a little bit more room so we can fit the whole thing in there nicely. And what I wanna do is find the paths that need to be manipulated, but only on the X axis. I don't wanna modify anything on the Y axis in this timeline. That'll make sense in just a little bit. But basically, I think I wanna move like this handle right here. I wanna move that out to the right. I wanna move this one out to the left a little bit, and maybe bring these vertices in towards the center and bring their handles out. But I don't wanna just start grabbing points and moving them around. I wanna first set default keyframes for those paths. So this one right here, let's start in the bottom left corner. I wanna set a position keyframe on the X position for that path point, as well as this one right here. And I know I wanna modify this handle and this handle. So with that one selected, I'm going to go to the length property, set a keyframe there, grab this handle. That would be this property right here. And let's just start with those couple of keyframes. So all of these are being keyed down here. And if I open this up further, you can see we have the in length for vertex 12. We have the out length for vertex 1. But I don't even need to really see that right now. Let's just go to the end and start manipulating those paths. So I'm gonna zoom in one more time with Control+, pan around with the space bar, and I wanna grab this vertex right here, click and drag it to the right while holding Shift, so it's only manipulating the X property here. And let's just bring it all the way to the center, and then grab this handle, which I don't think I've set a keyframe for. Let's press U and see if it brings up any keyframes in the timeline. It doesn't. So let's go back to this first frame, set a keyframe on that length property. I also could have just looked right there to see if there was a keyframe applied. Go to the end and let's pull that out so that we get that nice rounded corner right there. That looks good. All right, now let's grab this point, bring it back in all the way to the center. This should be the same value, so of 0 on the X, I'll change that down to 0. Then grab that tangent point, go to the start, set a keyframe there for the length, and then increase the length out. Let's be perfectly symmetrical here. I change this one, we'll round it off to 90, and I'll change this one to 90 as well. Now those path points and different values are also going to be interpolating between those two timelines, which again is something that would be much more difficult to do inside of After Effects. Let's take a look at the path points up at the top and do something similar here. I'd actually like to bring this point out a little bit. I'm gonna zoom in. And actually, no, I wanna bring it into the center, not further out. I just need to make sure I go back to the beginning and set an X position keyframe on both of those vertices for the default state. Then we'll go forward, bring these into 0 on the X, so they're nice and symmetrical at the top, and then grab this handle right here, which already has a keyframe set on its length, and bring that out even further. So we'll just drag it out to about there. Let's round that off to 110. and do the same thing here. Drag this out to 110. All right, let me press F to frame that. When I clicked on this group, it exited the path editing mode, but I can get right back into it by pressing Enter again and one more time. But now we're gonna see that animation playing back. That looks pretty good. Let's add in some easing now so that this is nice and snappy. I'm gonna select all of these keyframes. I'm gonna come over to my interpolation panel and click on the cubic button, and then just increase this all the way out to the most extreme while holding Shift to give me 1001 on my interpolation values. Now if I play this back, we're gonna have very snappy animation. Let's change this to ping pong so it goes back and forth. And now we can see that very snappy movement. I'm gonna go ahead and exit out of this edit mode just by pressing Enter so I don't see those path points anymore. And we've got our animation of the bread, but it's playing back extremely smoothly because I haven't set up my time options yet. The snap key's default is set to 60 frames per second, but I wanna change that down to 12 frames per second. That on its own isn't enough to actually get the animation to play back at 12 frames per second though. It's just setting the interval that I can set keyframes for, basically the frame duration of my timeline. I need to go back into that menu and check on quantize as well. That is what's going to force the refresh interval to match the snap key's value. And now I've got my 12 frames per second playback that I really wanted. Now I also wanna make my timeline just a little bit longer because I've animated this before already, so I know I need this to be 1 second and 2 frames. So I'll just type that in, and I'm going to drag all of these keyframes to the end of this timeline. So I'll select them all, drag them out, and there we go. Now our animation just takes a little bit longer to play back, and we can move on to the next element, which is this transform box. This is gonna be much simpler to keyframe because it's just position values. Again, just on the X-axis, so let's go into our transform box, and I'll start with the path of that outline rectangle for the frame of the transform box, and I'll change the size width right there, set a keyframe at the start, and then change this down to, let's say, 60. And then we'll grab these right here. If I hold Control and click, it's going to do a deep selection, basically selecting within the group. And then I'll hold Shift and select these 3 boxes. I wanna set a position X keyframe right there at the start. Move forward, just drag this over and snap it right to that line. Again, click while holding Shift to grab these. I'll set a position X keyframe there and then drag them over. Now all that's left is selecting all of these keyframes and making sure they all have the exact same easing values down here. Now that that's done, everything should play back and feel very nice and snappy. That's all there is to the X animation. What I need to do now is the Y animation, but I don't want to do it on this timeline. I want to make a duplicate timeline for that specific Y animation. So let's just rename this one by double clicking. I'll call it X animation, and then I'll right click on it and say duplicate. This gives me an identical timeline if I play it back, same playback settings, frame rate, all of that, but I don't want this X motion. So I'm going to select all of these keyframes and delete. That's not going to delete any assets, just the keyed properties. So we're essentially back to the default state now. And now I can do the exact same thing, but on the Y axis. And I'm not going to make you sit here and watch me do this. It's the exact same process as what we had on the X animation timeline. I'm just going to do it over here on the Y timeline, which I still need to rename. So I'll just time lapse through this and show you the result. The most important thing with this process is that you're not overlapping any kinds of keyframes. And what I mean by that is I only set X position keyframes on those vertices and on the shapes of the transform box in the X timeline. In the Y timeline, I'm only manipulating things on the Y axis. I'm not setting any keyframes on the exact same properties between these two timelines. And that might be a little bit confusing right now, but just trust me, only key unique properties on each timeline, and you'll see why in just a little bit. So there's our Y animation, everything that's going on the Y axis. It's mirroring what's going on in the X animation. Now we need to combine these two timelines together, and this is where it gets really, really cool. So let's move to the state machine. And this is something we haven't really taken a look at yet, but this is basically what's telling the Rive player what to display. And by default, if I press spacebar, it's going to give us the timeline that's selected right here on this node. And we can even see the playback going back and forth on that ping pong animation. So we've got our X animation timeline connected to entry. Entry is basically what's telling Rive what to display, the player itself, what it should be playing back for us. and it's connected to that timeline with this line. Wherever I move this node around, that's gonna follow it. Now I could change this to the Y animation by clicking and dragging a timeline out to here, and then maybe delete this relationship and click and drag that line over here. Now if I press the spacebar, it's gonna play my Y animation. I also could have just selected the timeline and then come over to the right panel over here and change the timeline source from Y to X, and then that will swap the animation for me. So there's different ways of connecting timelines to this state machine, but what's gonna be really powerful is the layering system up here. So let's just reframe this a little bit so we can see this nice and clearly. With the X animation set up on this instance of the state machine, I'm gonna rename this layer by double clicking it, and I'll just call it X. So this will be our X state machine layer. And if I right click on it and duplicate, then I'll change this to Y. And just like we have two timelines for those two separate animations, we're gonna have two layers playing back those two animations. So let's select this X animation node, change the timeline over here to Y animation, and let's press the spacebar again. Now look what's happening. Both the X and the Y animations have been combined to give us this scaling down and scaling up motion, which isn't exactly what I want for the animation, but it's a very cool way of combining two separate sets of keyframes on the exact same assets. And this is a very, very simple example of how powerful layers can be. There are much more advanced examples of how you can use layers in Rive to combine and blend these different timelines. My friend Joey Judkins has just started making some Rive content over on his channel. I'd highly encourage you to go watch one of his latest videos where he gets into this a little bit more in depth and really demystifies what's going on with this state machine and layering animations and just how powerful it all can be. Also, the Rive official YouTube account has tons of great training on everything in Rive, so go check that out as well. But let me just show you how we can push this a little bit further, since this isn't exactly the animation I want. I want the X and the Y to be offset. So what I want to do is jump back to my Y animation timeline, and I'm going to change the way that it's being looped a little bit. Right now, it's just doing a ping pong animation back and forth between two sets of keyframes. I want to change my duration to be something longer. I'll just make this 5 seconds longer, and we'll expand this out so we can see much further. So my midpoint, the second state of this animation, is 1 second, 2 frames. So I'm gonna double that to 2 seconds, 4 frames, and then copy and paste those keyframes. So now I've built in a manual loop here. Now what I wanna do is just select all those keyframes again, copy and paste them, so I have 2 loops of the same animation. And all of that interpolation should still be nice and eased. It looks great. And I need to come back into this and check on work area as well. And this will give me an in and out point to allow me to set a range for the animation to actually play back, a range of this timeline. So if I set it here, it's gonna be exactly the same as what we had before. It will loop between those 2 points. But if I wanna change the starting and ending points of my loop, I could say go 6 frames forward, move the in point there, and then go 6 frames forward with the period key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, set my out point there, and now we have different starting and ending points of our loop, and it should still play back seamlessly, and it does. So now if we jump back to the state machine and play this, those 2 animations are overlapping and their easings are not synchronized anymore, and it gives us this very cool overlapping motion that would be much more difficult to do inside of After Effects without some more custom manual labor. So let's go back into our Y animation. I actually want to change this range so that it starts right here. So let's count the frames. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames forward. I don't like that. Let's back it up to 6. I don't like doing odd numbers in a 12 frames per second timeline. And then we'll go to this keyframe here and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Move our out point there, and now that's gonna loop at a different starting and end point. And if I play it back here, now it's gonna get nice and squished, then scale down, stretch out, stretch back up. That's the motion I was looking for. So that's how you combine 2 different timelines using the state machine with 2 different layers. That point I kept making before about setting keys that were unique on each timeline, that comes into play with these layers. Whatever's furthest to the right in your layers tabs is going to override anything before it. So if I had X keyframes in my Y timeline, they're going to negate or override whatever's in my X timeline, because that layer layer, which is set up here in our state machine, comes before the Y animation. Even if it's just a standard keyframe with no other keyframes at all in the timeline, it's just a value that's recorded, it's going to override things. So if you ever run into issues when you're combining animations with different timelines and multiple layers, it's likely due to a keyframe that was set accidentally and just needs to be deleted, and that will get you to the animation that you're after. Again, I realize this is a very basic animation, but it does show off the capabilities of the state machine, combining different layers of animation in a very complex way, but a very easy way to manage. And this is the same process that I had when first starting to learn Rive, and I think it's a great next step in understanding some of the unique possibilities and features that Rive has over After Effects. I hope you enjoyed learning about combining timelines in Rive. Let me know what other Rive topics you'd like me to cover, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next tutorial where we'll be taking a more in-depth look at the state machine and creating a fully interactive animation. Don't forget to grab that PDF down in the description. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.